In many rural areas of the American West, cutting firewood in national forests is a necessary chore if you want a warm house through the winter. Our home in mountainous central Idaho was no exception. It was normal for my dad to pick me and my brothers up after school and head into the mountains for an afternoon of firewood gathering. My dad would fell the trees, then saw them into chunks. My brothers and I had the task of rolling the wood to the truck and loading it. We would continue this assembly line process until we had a truckload of wood, usually before nightfall. Hot, sweaty, and exhausted, we would pile into the truck cab and make our way down the mountain. At home, the next day, we would unload and split the wood and stack it into neat little rows. This process was repeated until we had a winter's worth of fuel for our house, our grandma's cabin, and any extra for elderly neighbors. This particular afternoon, we decided to try a different logging road on the other side of the valley. No real reason for the change, but my dad said he wanted a change of scenery. This logging road hadn't been maintained in some time. Large rocks and fallen branches littered the path. My brothers and I had to walk out in front, pushing rocks and wood out of the way, as my dad lurched the truck up the switchbacks. Yard by yard, we slowly made our way up the mountain. That hike was physically brutal. As we ascended the mountain and got farther into the trees, this odd feeling started to set in. I wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion from the hike or something more. There was an electricity in the air, like the whole mountain was buzzing at a wavelength just below my senses. In some odd way, I felt like the mountain knew we were there, and it wasn't welcomed to the fact. I wanted to say something to my brothers, but before I opened my mouth, my younger brother said, "Does anyone else feel like we're not welcome here?" My older brother and I stopped in our tracks and looked back at him. Both of us nodded in agreement. This moment was broken by my dad honking and motioning us to continue to clear the path. Reluctantly, we pushed forward to a small clearing in the woods where we finally stopped the truck. My dad, oblivious to our apprehension, or simply choosing to ignore it, grabbed his saw and went to work. As the wood was felled and loaded, I couldn't shake this ominous feeling enveloping me like a dark shroud. I noticed my brothers were taking occasional glances over their shoulders as we worked. Everyone, but my dad, it seemed, was on edge. The sun nestled down into the trees and twilight began to set in. As the light drained from the sky, my anxiety only intensified. It wasn't until my dad unexpectedly told us to load up that a wave of relief flooded over me. I could see the tension in my brothers melt away as well. The truck wasn't fully loaded, an oddity. Getting half a load was a waste, according to my dad. We would sometimes work into the dark just to make sure that the truck was full, but tonight, he seemed eager to head home. With everything loaded, we started down the road, and although dead tired, everyone seemed to be in a much lighter mood. We were chatting and cracking jokes while trying to blow off steam from the afternoon. We were almost out of the tree line and into the valley desert. Going down the switchbacks, you want to be careful, especially with a load, even if it was half that. A brown blur jumped up from the downslope side of the switchback. "Shit!" was the only word that came out of my dad's mouth as he slammed on the brakes. Loaded with wood and traveling downhill, there was no way to avoid smashing into the blur. The truck finally ground to a standstill. The four of us peered through the windshield, nobody saying a word. Illuminated in the yellow glow of our headlights was a crumpled body of a deer. Grumbling and cursing the deer's existence, My dad exited the truck to investigate. Doing as they were told, my brother stayed put in the truck. I didn't listen, following close behind my dad. The truck was fine. We hadn't been traveling fast when we smacked the deer. Just some hair and blood in the grill guard. Hitting a deer really wasn't that unusual. The mountains were full of them. But what was unusual was the fact that the deer dropped so quickly. At faster speeds, deer could still be upright and sprinting away to die in the woods after a collision. That last burst of an adrenaline dump. This one fell over like a rag doll. Before even approaching the carcass, a deep, foul smell hit us. Deer smell bad when they're alive, but this was on a whole other level. It was the smell of decay and rot. My stomach began to turn as we got closer. My nostrils were burning. Coming up on the deer, it was clearly dead. Really, really dead. The stench was so overwhelming, my eyes were watering. The body was a true horror scene. The deer's eyes were gone, replaced with sunken, hollow holes. As if to overcompensate for their absence, the tongue was swollen and black as coal. It could not be contained and hung out the side of its mouth. The underbelly was split open. Entrails and offal spilled into the dirt. In the dim headlights, it looked as though the deer's fur and viscera were moving, wiggling almost. Holding my breath, I bent down for a closer look, and my heart stopped. The deer, inside and out, was covered in maggots. It was dead all right, but our truck didn't kill it. Clearly, it had been dead for days, if not weeks. I backed away retching, and that electric anxiety came screaming back. My dad has always been the quiet, stoic type, but right now, even in the dim headlights of the truck, I could see the abject horror in his face. His gaze wasn't on the deer, but focused down the mountain. Poorly masking the fear in his voice, he told me firmly to walk back to the truck and get inside. I obeyed without objection. As I grabbed the door handle, a loud shriek came out of the trees. Branches were shattering and breaking. Something was heading up the slope towards us. I slammed my door closed just as my dad reached the truck. Before his door was shut, he pressed on the accelerator. The truck launched forward, sending us over the deer carcass and racing downhill. With mine and my brother's yelling, it was hard to tell if the shrieking was following us. Our truck popped out of the tree line and into the desert sagebrush. Once out of the woods, everything quieted down. We were left with only the rumble of the engine and wind through the half-opened windows. Pulling into our property, the truck came to a stop. We sat in silence. No one moved to leave the truck. Everyone started talking at once. We all had questions. What was that screaming? How does a dead deer jump uphill in front of a truck? There was no way the truck killed it. Dad just shook his head and motioned for us to quiet down. That deer was dead when we hit it. It didn't jump out in front of us. It was thrown at us. We stared at him. He explained that all day up in the mountains he had felt uneasy. Not wanting to worry us boys, he kept it to himself. He described it like walking into a stranger's living room while they were all upstairs asleep. That feeling never left him, and as twilight came, he happened to catch a shadow in the corner of his eye. Not far into the woods, he saw figures moving from tree to tree. He couldn't focus on them long enough for a good look before they dodged behind trees. His stomach dropped. Working hard to keep his composure, he hurried us to the truck to leave. It was after hitting the deer and discovering it was long dead that my dad pieced together what was happening. Something threw that deer to get us to stop. Before the shrieking began, he could hear something moving in the darkness beyond the road. It was a trap. Running back to the truck could have started an ambush or triggered a prey drive, so we walked back to the truck. The second we were inside, he drove that truck downhill with no intention of stopping for anyone or anything. The feeling of electricity didn't disappear until we hit the county highway. My brothers and I never saw anything as we drove away, but those screams in the forest will never leave my mind. We didn't gather firewood the rest of the season. For the first time in his life, my dad just bought what we needed. And although we started to gather wood again the next season, we've never been up to that particular mountain. The Forest Service has permanently closed and reclaimed that road. The only way back up into those woods is a long hike, one I'm not interested in ever taking again. Two days ago, I was with my friends, Callie and Xander, and we were at my grandparents' house while they were out of town because I'm the caretaker of the house when they're gone, and my friends wanted to hang out for a little bit. After I finished all my chores, I decided I wanted to take them to my old hideout in the woods. I do remember telling them that the woods were off limits, and that if my uncle caught us, that I'd be in trouble. Xander was a little hesitant, but ended up going with me and Callie. I just want to clarify that they both agreed to go, and I didn't force them. Anyway, like a group of stupid teens in a horror movie, we all walked into the woods just looking for some fun and to mess around. We get to the opening in the woods, and I tell them that it's going to be a very big climb. Callie pulls out her phone and starts recording. Xander sounds a little scared and says that he's not good with climbing, but Callie ends up convincing him to go anyway. After Xander agrees, Callie screams, "Bring it on," in a joking way. It's important for the rest of the story. Before entering the woods with Xander and I. We get about halfway to the hideout when Xander stops and says that he has an eerie feeling. I tell him it's probably nothing and that we should continue walking. A few minutes later, we're at my old hideout, and Callie started being all loud and obnoxious, and I reminded her to be quiet because of my uncle. At some point, Xander asks if we can leave, because his back was starting to hurt, so we got up and started walking back. We got out of the woods and started the walk back to the house, when Xander and Callie started to freak out, saying they really didn't have a good feeling. I told them I didn't feel anything, but right as I did, I got a very scary image in my head. It was this thing, about 6'5", a black muscular figure with horns crawling on all fours. I tell them this, and Callie ends up saying that she needs to sit down because it feels like someone had punched her in the stomach, and then she collapses onto the ground. I look at Xander and ask him to help me get her up. She was awake, but still really out of it. We started walking with her, and we only get a few steps when she regains complete consciousness. She looks at us and says, "I'm scared." Right after she says that, we hear a little kid screaming bloody murder, and without thinking, we all sprint back to the house. We get back to the house, and Xander and I are freaking out at this point, but Callie is oddly calm. We asked her what was wrong, and she won't answer. 5 minutes into trying to see if she's okay, she starts mumbling in a language that isn't English. For as long as I've known Callie, I know that the only language she knows is English. She keeps mumbling, and then starts laughing too. I tell Xander to get Callie into the car while I run inside the house to lock the doors. Xander's holding Callie at this point, and I'm trying to find my key. I find it in my pocket and I unlock the car for them to get in. I hop in the car and crank it while Xander is getting her buckled in and everything. We start heading to my dad's house to get Sage, because at this point, Xander and I have a feeling that she's not Callie anymore, if you know what I mean. I'm speeding through some back roads to get to my dad's house because I realized the longer we're in the car, the worse Callie was getting. She was unresponsive and not reacting to anything we said to her. We get to my dad's and I run inside and I get the Sage. I tell Xander to take her outside to the backyard so my neighbors wouldn't see us. Xander sits her down and I light the Sage, and I'm smudging the Sage and saying something along the lines of, "This is her body, not yours. You need to leave. I do not welcome you here anymore. You're not allowed to haunt her, my friends, the house, or me." And about 20 minutes later, Callie comes back. We asked her what happened, and she said she didn't remember anything and that she felt trapped. 6 or 7 minutes later, my dad called me and told me that he had just left work and that he was going to pick up some food. I told him I had friends over and he offered to get them food too. At this point, we had all calmed down. We tell him what we want. We eat and laugh like nothing happened, but it doesn't end there at all. The next day, yesterday, my friend Xander didn't come to school. I texted him asking if he was okay, and this is what he said to me. "Yeah, I'm fine. Something happened last night and it made me stay up till 3 a.m., so my mom let me stay home." And then, hours later, he followed up with, "I think a spirit attached to me, like an evil one." And Callie texted me saying something felt very wrong at her house. She sent me a video, and it was her walking into her room, and the blinds were moving. Stuff was knocked off shelves, and she was just freaking out because none of her family was at the house. She was alone for hours after we got out of school that day too. And to be honest, I don't like the feeling I get sleeping at my dad's. Not to mention I have guinea pigs, and they've been acting weird since this happened. They're more aggressive towards me and one another. I really don't know what to make of this, and I need help understanding this. About a year ago, my girlfriend and I were on a trail to Lamoille Lake in northern Nevada. It's about 1.5 miles each way, I think, and usually pretty well populated. It was that day as well. There were at least a handful of people on the trail here and there. Plenty down at the trailhead parking lot, and it was otherwise a totally normal sunny day. Evening began to come, and we started heading back down, not wanting to be out when it got dark, as there was no cell service up there for quite a distance, and it was just an afternoon weekend hike. We started down the trail, and I got the slightest hint of a bad feeling, like we definitely needed to get back to our car before it got dark. I think that's just generally common sense and doesn't need to be prompted by a sixth sense or something. Still, I kept an eye out as we went. Weirdly, absolutely nothing happened until we were maybe 300 yards from the parking lot. The trees had largely been left behind as we descended in elevation, and bushes, large and small, were there instead. There was a creek that ran through to our right. Ahead of us, maybe 50 yards, was a lone woman and her medium-sized dog on a leash. I had my head on a swivel the whole way down because I was trying to keep an eye out and make sure that hint of a bad feeling didn't amount to anything I was also carrying. This woman was ahead of us by about the same distance for a good while down the trail, and I felt somewhat responsible for her safety as well. Mountain lions are known to live higher up in those mountains, the Rubies, and she was pretty much in sight the whole time, so I was trying to keep an eye out for her too. As we were walking, me and my girlfriend both hear what seemed like a big boulder sliding and grating along a stone surface. It lasted a few seconds, and we were both looking at the stone surface mountain slope, maybe 600 yards to our left, fully expecting to see a landslide of some sort. But there was nothing, and daylight was still good enough that I think if there was something to see on that front, we would have seen it. I immediately looked to the lady ahead of us, and just a second later, she and her dog started booking it. Right as they did, a herd of deer came sprinting out of the bushes away from the boulder sound. It must have been closer than it sounded. They ran across the creek and kept going to our right. After pausing for a second to discuss what that weird sound might have been, we hurried along as well, and I drew my gun. We passed the same little section where the lady was when she took off, and thankfully, nothing happened. We didn't hear or see anything in those bushes, though I'm not surprised. A whole herd of deer was in there, and we couldn't see them until they ran out, despite being at a higher elevation at the time. We quickly made it back to the parking lot, and I put my gun back in its holster. It felt safer getting back to the pavement for some reason. We caught up with the woman and the dog. She was catching her breath and pacing a little. We asked if she heard the weird sound, and she said that she heard the loud bouldery sound, and then off to her left, directly close by, right where the deer came running from, she distinctly heard a big, low growl after the boulder sound, and then she heard the deer coming and ran to get out of the way. The deer probably would have run right into her if she hadn't moved. Watching this happen from a ways above and behind just a minute or two previous, they came out onto the trail right where she had been a second before. We determined it might have been a mountain lion. I'm all for believing that, but I still have two questions. 1, why did I get the feeling that we needed to leave, even subtly, around 45 minutes before anything strange happened? And 2, why or how did whatever it was make a big sound of a boulder scraping along, not tumbling, but sliding, very different sounds, and then there was a clear growl heard by the woman, but not by us. I think that indicates that there was something absolutely in those bushes, but I'm very confused about the bigger sound. I doubt the same animal made a huge boulder scraping sound, and the deer didn't run, and then the same creature made a normal growl sound that came from that same place, and that was what scared the deer off. I don't know what I believe about this, but it was certainly a strange experience.